This video is going to be about greenskin and how I went about painting the skin on my orcs. I got these Orc Brutes from Games Workshop that I've been working on for a while, and it was now time to give them their green skin that they were born into. And I have some thoughts about skin. Like, real skin has a lot of tones going in it. Like my skin is, it's pink, red, yellow, purple under the eyes, things like that. And I was after the same thing when I set out to paint my greenskins, to have other tones going in it apart from green. Now, the main theme here is that I want a blue tone to the green skin. In theory, this is the green skin that I will be using on an entire army. And I know I have a very prolonged painting speed. I take a lot of time painting my miniatures, but I was after a technique that I could sort of work fast with, even though there's going to be a lot of different paints involved and quite a few steps. I tried to work out a scheme that didn't involve too much having to pay attention to details, and where sort of gradients would be easy and natural, so that I can pretty much slob it on more than I usually do. And I've set this video up so that if you want to, you can actually follow me step by step, all the paints I use, and use my, greenskin recipe if you like. But you can also just watch it to be inspired by sort of the techniques and how I've been thinking about going about the whole different tones and everything. Now, these orcs have been zenithal primed, and I'm trying to keep the zenithal priming in consideration while I paint. I recently made a video about zenithal priming, or why you should or shouldn't be zenithal priming. And especially in this case, that video is really worth checking out. What I've been doing is, it's zenithal primed and I will be painting over it, but I'm trying to keep a mental picture, or even a picture sort of on my phone, of the zenithal primed miniature, just to see where it's supposed to be dark and where it's supposed to be light. To start with, we're going to cover this with the darkest base coat. I'm using a heavy green and an abyssal blue. The blue, it's pretty much black. It's a very, very dark blue. I think you might as well use a black if you haven't got this, dark blue. And I've watered both of these paints down quite a bit. And I'm using a sort of wet blending technique, trying to get the abyssal blue where my zenithal priming is its darkest, and the heavy green on all the other places. Wet blending is basically when you're painting with several paints at the same time, trying to blend them into each other while they're still wet on the miniature. Now, the result is a very dark, it's almost black. And this is the effect of the abyssal blue, but also because sort of the dark from the paints are thin, so the dark from the zenithal priming is sort of shining through. I want to add a little bit more green to this, so I add another layer of the heavy green, but only in the spots that are not supposed to be like the darkest crevices. So you want to preserve the absolute darkest, like under the arms and things like that. In the absolute darkest places, this is the only paint they're going to get. As I said before, I am really trying to follow the zenithal priming, and the zenithal priming basically creates this illusion of that the miniature is lighted from an imaginary sky. And because of that, like in the darkest places, there's, it's pretty much black. And I want to keep that. So, you can make sure that you actually have covered everything with this first base coat, because in the darkest parts, nothing more is going to end up being on top of that. The next layer is sick green, mixed half and half, 50-50, with heavy green. And this is going on top of everything, again, that isn't supposed to be dark. Like, I try and leave, you can think in sort of gradients. So we have the abyssal blue that's black, it's the darkest. Then we have a bit of heavy green, and this is the next. So you want to leave a little bit of abyssal blue and heavy green, and then this next layer is next in line. If you paint on top of the heavy green and the abyssal blue, then there was not really any point of the first step, and you will be losing out on this sort of gradual shading process that I will be using. That being said, you want to get this in as many places as possible, because the other stuff is just for the absolute recesses. I have this trick with my thumb that I've been using to sort of check mixtures. So I've just paint a little bit of the heavy green on my thumb, and then draw another line with this mixture of sort of a 50-50 with the sick green. And if the sick green mixture looks a bit too bright, the step might be too, you won't end up with a nice gradient. It'll just look really sharp. But the thumb's a nice place to have it on, because you can just sort of check your gradients on there pretty nice. The next step is using a Caspian blue. So now we're starting to get some blue tones in here. If you're watching this going like, oh, I don't want my greenskins to be blue, they're supposed to be red and green. You can still use the same sort of technique here. Just switch out the blues for another tone. It could be purple, it could be a brown, it could be, whatever you fancy your greenskins to be mixed with. But I try and get this blue in sort of where my previous green, the sick green mixed with heavy green, meets the heavy green. That's where I'm trying to get this Caspian blue. And you can see, I don't know if you can see when I paint, but most of this, I try and draw a lot of lines like this across the gradient, not sort of trying to do something smooth like that, because then you just end up with sort of lines like this. But I try and paint lots of sort of strokes. And this is what I figured out when I was testing this out is, one, yeah, it adds the blue that I like, but it sort of creates a nice gradient between the dark and the light. And I'm not really trying to cover everything. It's fine to miss some spots, but especially sort of everything pointing downwards, and you can play around with it. But basically, where the last two greens met each other, that's where I try and get this blue. And then on top of this, I use the sick green, not sort of mixed with any heavy green or anything like that, just straight sick green out of the bottle with some water in it. And where we are now in sort of steps, this is pretty much the mid-tone. This is like the green. If you would have painted this sort of traditionally, probably the sick green would be like you covered the entire miniature with sick green and put a wash on there and then work up some highlights. That's sort of where we at. So this sick green, again, I try and remember the zenithal priming or look at some pictures. It's obviously not supposed to go where the previous gradients are. We're sort of building upwards. So whatever's sticking out, whatever's bright on the previous zenithal priming, that's where this sick green goes. Now, because this sick green is sort of the medium, the base shade, halfway stop, whatever, I decided to paint the eyes, because usually when I paint eyes, this is an eye. And usually I like rub paint everywhere else. Not really, but it's an easy place to start painting the eyes, because it's easy to cover up any mistakes just with the sick green. And I decided my orcs should have orange eyes. Looks fierce. You can do whatever you want, purple, blue, whatever. I started with the white just to get some, it's difficult to paint orange on a dark green. So I put some white on there, and then the orange. And then I actually used a wash. I don't use that many washes, but this is perfect because it sort of flows into the recesses. And then the orange again, and then a little bit of a highlight with the yellow mixed into the orange. Once that was done, I started highlighting the skin. The first step was a Bering blue and goblin green mixed 50-50 with sick green. And again, water in both of them. I'm using these two paints to highlight, again, whatever's supposed to be brighter. So, chest muscles on the arms, anything sort of pointing upwards, anything that my memory of the zenithal priming is reminding me of, that this should be bright, whatever's sort of sticking out. Nothing under the arms, nothing like that, just sort of raised bits and things pointing towards the sky. And I use these two sort of here and there. In some places I put the green, in some places I put the blue, in some places I put the blue and think that, that didn't look really nice, and I put the green. And I use the same, it's sort of more of a random sort of, not stippling, but trying to do lines. I'm trying to think again, like this is skin, it's supposed to have a bit of texture. It's supposed to have, not be, in my world, super smooth, especially not on these fellows. They're like, they don't really wear clothes, do they? And they are out fighting, and so their skin should be really sort of worn by weather and weapons. And they probably sleep on like rocks. It's not very nice for the skin. They don't use lotion. Anyway, it's supposed to be sort of random, and I don't mind if at some point there's a blue line and at another point there's a green line. It just sort of, when you look at them from a bit of a distance, it just adds to the character, and it doesn't have to be smooth. And this goes in line with the fact that I want to be able to do this kind of rapidly in my world. You will have noticed by now that I'm painting 4 of them at the same time. It's not to confuse you, going like, where did that fellow come from? It's just because I want to show you that I'm actually doing 4 at the same time, which means that it's sort of a fast process, but also because, I had 4 of them to paint, so I did them all at the same time. The next step is more highlights, but also more color, more tones. I've got a light turquoise and a goblin green. So the light turquoise, I add humongous, I was going to say humongous amounts of water, but almost turning it into sort of like a glaze. And I use that sort of wherever I think that the blue looks really nice. It's usually pointing downwards, but all the previous layers of blue, where I want to emphasize that blue, and it's usually sort of like a blue highlight. This is a really strong, like the turquoise is really a strong color, so therefore it's really watered down, and I can sort of brush it out a bit, sort of like a glaze. Whereas the goblin green, I haven't got as much water in that, and use it more sort of traditionally just on the raised bits that I want to sort of exaggerate highlights even more. You can see with the goblin green that once more I'm sort of doing sort of like stippling or whatever. Just adding more. Now that I've come this far, it's time to do the faces. Now with the faces on these fellows, I want them to be a bit different. I had this idea of sort of a mixture between the feeling of like, have they got like tribal paint going? Like they've actually painted paint in their face? Or is their skin in their face, does it have a different character that almost looks like a tribal painting? And the faces on these oryx, on the sculpts, they have a lot of nice things sticking out. And so it's a perfect opportunity to just add something different to the miniature. I also wanted the crevices to be sort of red. And if that's sort of their skin has cracked and there's blood, or if they've just ripped the head off an elf recently and there's still some blood on their face, I don't really know. So I start with this sort of blood thing, and the color is called Sanquine Highlights, and I paint it sort of in the mouth around sort of where the gums would be, and then in the crevices of all the cracks sort of on the face. I then add a pastel blue and troll blood highlights to my wet palette. And this is going to be going on all the sort of raised areas on the face. I haven't really got a plan to where I put the blue. Apart from that, it's mainly blue around the lips. But in the rest of the face, I just try and follow whatever the sculpt looks like, because they've got a lot of things sticking out. And some of them turn out to be blue. Some of them turn out to be this sort of more flesh-colored, grey, fleshy tone of the troll blood. But there's not really any plan. But it's sort of, I'm trying to think sort of tribal painting, and that it might start more blue around the mouth and then go sort of blend it into the grayer paint. I've also got a bit of Caspian blue to wherever I exaggerate and, the highlights become too much, I can go back and add some of that darker Caspian blue in the recesses. Now with the teeth is nothing really super fancy. I've got a graphite, it's basically like a medium gray that I just paint all the teeth with. And then I put an Agrax Earthshade on top of that. And then I got a really watered down Prussian dark blue that I just add at the absolute bottom of the teeth, just to add some blue tones to these teeth. And then I go back to the graphite, the medium gray, trying to do sort of strips like this. I'm not really good at it. Like you watch people paint teeth nicely, they have these sort of lines going. I'm trying to do that, sort of succeeding. On top of that, I highlight with a nacre, and which is like a light brown grayish tone, and just the absolute tips of things, I just put some white on there. And then it's time for the final highlights. I've saved this to absolute last after the face, because if I've sort of done too many mistakes with something on the face, I can cover that paint up with this sort of highlight. I can also sort of gradually get this sort of blue and troll blood colors going into the skin a bit more seamlessly by adding this highlight afterwards. I use Goblin Green mixed with Livery Green, 50-50 and some water. Now this Livery Green, it can get really neon-y on you. So you might want to be a bit careful with how much of this you get on there, because you're starting to get into the verge of a really comic book style orc, like the Hulk kind of a green, I guess, maybe. Anyway, and I also have the pastel blue. And why I have the blue and the green, I mainly use the green. Sometimes I mixed even some of the pastel blue in with the other mixture, depending on what's underneath. In some places it's just more pure green, and I highlight that here and there with this green. And in some places there's more blue, and I want to have a sort of a bluer highlight, and there goes the pastel. And then sort of I have a mixture between the two, can go, yeah, you get it. Oh, and I forgot, there's a tongue involved. Some of these have tongues. If you're wondering why his face is looking a bit weird, it's because there's supposed to go a piece of metal over. I'm painting that separately with the armor. So that's why his face is looking a bit weird. But there, he's got a tongue, and I used a Caspian blue and just a pastel blue one just to highlight it a little bit. Something I haven't shown is the nails. They get done in the same way as the teeth, even like adding the blood color, like I did on the gums, on the teeth. I do the same thing, like a line of that where the nail starts, and then it's just the same procedure as how I did it with the teeth. Now you can, if you want, add more sort of textural details to the skin. I did some freckles with just a brown. I just added some brown dots and like highlighted them a little bit. Painted the scars in a bit of a different tone. But it's definitely easy once you've sort of done, just to add some bits and pieces here and there. And if you don't really like the look of them, you can always sort of cover it up a little bit with that sort of light, the last highlight colors. Then they're done. That's my green skin recipe. Now, there's a few things to say about this. One thing is I wanted my green skins to be fairly dark, not too highlighted. You can obviously add more highlights if you think they should be brighter. And as I said from the beginning, like this is how I, in my head, imagine my orcs. This is the tone of their skin. And I think that's very individual. Your green skin might be a bit different. So you can try and sort of imagine my process. If you like the result of how these miniatures turned out, but you're thinking, I don't really like the blue or whatever, then you can try the same process, but just switch the paints out. If you really like the result, you can just copy and paste, I wanted to show you a detail from the back of one of the orcs. And if we look closely at this, you can see that I've just been painting lines. it's not sort of super smooth gradients. It's not, it's not messy, but it's sort of, yeah, it's not super precise. And this is pretty much true for the rest of the entire Mini. It sort of looks a bit smoother here and there, but I have been trying to sort of work fast, and I've been trying to find tones of paint, different colors that look nice next to each other, so that when you look at it from sort of, still pretty close, it looks kind of smooth, and it just looks like there's a skin texture. And especially if you just have them on the table when you're gaming, it all blends together. But because I know that there has been a lot of paints involved, and you can still see that I've been working a lot on these. It's just not the one coat of paint and some wash and then, dry brushing some highlights. But I don't want to scare you away either by saying that this took ages, because it didn't really. I really tried to work fast. And this example with this, back sort of shows that it's mainly just doing this a couple of times and then the same thing on the other side. So I hope you liked my greenskin. This mainly for me was, I think it's fairly important. For one thing is, I think it's important to make skin sort of look like skin. I like the fact that there's a lot of different colors blending in, and there's like cold blues, there's like normal greens, there's warm greens. All of these together really create a texture that to me it looks like skin. It's also, obviously, it's darker where it's supposed to be dark and lighter where it's supposed to be light. But these different colors really do their thing. And I would really encourage you to, whatever skin you're painting, obviously this is about green skin, but it could be any sort of skin tones, is try and put some other colors in there. Even if it's a dwarf or an elf or a human, those three were actually, I guess, kind of identical. But you see my point, adding different color tones. If it's pink or purple or green or blue or anything, it doesn't really matter. That's up to you. It's your personal preference. But not sort of sticking to, okay, so I'm going to paint a human skin, so I'll buy like a human skin tone and then a human skin wash and then highlight with a brighter human skin tone is fine. Sorry, I'm not going to put you down. You may do that as well. I'm not telling you exactly how you should go about your life. I just want to encourage trying to blend some other colors in there, because skin usually isn't just skin toned. It's got other things going as well. Thanks for watching. I hope this can be sort of inspiring. Feel free to just use everything you've seen in whatever way you think fits best, and hope you get inspired to paint skin regardless of skin tone. Obviously, probably most of you will be thinking green, because this is what I was talking about throughout the entire video. You can like, subscribe, if you really like the content and want to support, like me buying a bottle of paint every now and again. You can support me on Patreon. And that was it. Bye.